Hey guys, it's Logan here with Hydra572. Today I'm going to be reviewing the Quartermaster QTR4 Hannibal. To give you guys an idea of the awkward position that I'm in, I'm going to give my 30-second review of this knife first. This is a blade made by really cool people who are new to the knife industry, who really care about knives. It's got an awesome style, and it's made with great materials. However, due to some unfortunate lockup issues, it basically amounts to a really large, really heavy, really expensive letter opener. So I guess the only place to go from there is forward. We'll start with the intended usage. I see this as a collection blade first and foremost for somebody who wants a really overbuilt knife to add to their collection at a low price. In terms of overbuilt knives, we're talking in reference to Direware and things like that. This is a relatively expensive knife. This also could be used for light EDC cutting, as we saw in my testing video of this blade. The pricing on Blade HQ, the Texas T, this coloration of the blade goes for $175, and the normal coloration, which is a black G10 and a satin blade, goes for $160. The blade profile, as you guys see there, is pretty unique. We have the compound grind. It's sort of a reverse Tonto Wharncliffe, but there is a slight angle change here at the tip of the blade. This is a very thick stock blade, as you guys can see there, contributing to that overbuilt feel that I talked about with intended usage. Talking about the belly, it's really only from the sub point forward. As you guys see, if we lay the knife flat, not very much of the knife is touching our table. Not the best profile for EDC usage. The tip is very, very thick, partially due to that reverse Tonto Wharncliffe type deal, and partially just due to the way that the knife is ground. The steel is 154 cm. As you guys saw, the retention in our cut tests were pretty weird. I think this knife might have come from the factory with a slight wire edge, or it might just be that the way the edge is ground, you have to hold the knife in a very specific way to get the best cutting engagement. Regardless, sharpening was easy enough to do touch-ups with the Sharpmaker. I haven't put this baby on the wicked edge. 154 cm is a good steel, and you could definitely put a really wicked edge on this knife, provided that you had the skill and a system that would allow you to do so. I have absolute faith that this knife would take an absolutely awesome edge. The grind, as you guys see, is a compound grind, meaning that we have a different grind, both hollow, one on the tip and one on the main body of the blade. We have a large swedge that you guys see there with a whole lot of material towards the tip, which contributes to a really good deployment. Moving into deployment here, we have a flipper, and this is one of the best flippers that I've ever used, in all honesty. It compares up with my Zero Tolerance 560. We also have our triple thumb studs here, which I thought might be obnoxious, but actually work pretty well. It's like a nice big shelf that you can put your thumb on, flick that blade out of there. They have the patented, I believe, ORB bearing system in the pivot of this blade, and it works really well. You have a large, heavy blade, and due to that extra weight forward, due to the way the knife is ground, it deploys pretty damn sweet, and it falls closed pretty dang easily. Really well done pivot system. Moving on to the lock, here's where we're going to encounter some problems. You guys remember from that 30-second little segment that I did at the beginning, this knife kind of falls down due to locking mechanism. The first blade that I got from Quartermaster had lockup issues right out of the box. The lock face was just not machined very well. It led to rock lock and unsteady lockup, had a very weak detent. It was just a problem. I got in touch with Quartermaster, sent it in, and they gave me excellent warranty service, as they've given to other people who I've talked to, and repaired the blade. However, this one wasn't perfect either in terms of how the lock faces were machined, and I noticed as I started to do that testing that I was seeing just a little bit of lock slip creep in, and that's really unacceptable for a blade in this price range. Unfortunately, you can't have the knife falling apart with light usage. Also, though they don't really advertise it this way, a knife this large, I would think you should be thinking about using it for defensive purposes. It's a tad on the large side for any kind of utility cutting that I would want to do with a folder. So for a knife this big, I want to be comfortable using it to defend myself as well as using it to open boxes. And due to the way that they built the lock on this knife, I really don't feel comfortable with that. My father has always talked about with knives wanting a really secure lock that he's really certain that he can't disengage by twisting his hand around the knife. This comes from an experience that he had with a slip joint where he was trying to do some twisting, prying type thing and flipped the knife over and closed it into his thumb. Since then, he's been very weary and has always wanted very secure locking mechanisms out of the way of the manipulation that you would do just doing your simple cutting tasks. I always sort of thought that he was over wary, but with this knife, I really understand what he's talking about. If you were using this knife in some kind of task where you had to twist, I could see how with a completely exposed liner like this is the liner right here, this is the locking liner. I could see how dragging your hand across that would open up the knife. Now you do have the flipper to protect yourself. Hopefully the flipper closes onto your hand, but still that is a really unfriendly situation that could happen, and due to that I'm not really comfortable recommending this knife for any kind of hard EDC usage or defensive tactical type usage. That's really unfortunate because for a knife this heavy and this expensive and just this large, I think most people would say it's a reasonable expectation to think that you could use this knife in a defensive type role. Otherwise, I just don't know why you would buy a knife this big. Maybe to impress your friends. Like I said, that primary intended usage would be collection. I could see somebody buying this blade because they wanted to show it off, not so much for the really heavy use folder type application or the defensive use folder. That's pretty unfortunate. Moving on to play, like I said, both that I've had developed some front to back kind of blade play, and that's pretty disappointing with a blade this expensive and this overbuilt feeling. Also just very unsettled by how it deteriorated over time. I think that points to a young company who's not really up to snuff on their lock face machining yet. Lock face machining is really hard. The angle that you cut the knife stock on going this way really matters a whole lot, and it's not an easy thing to do. I also think that the locking liners themselves are a little bit on the thin side for a knife that's already this heavy. I think we could have added another couple extra ounces if it got us some strength. Moving on to the clip, we have two-way tip up to side tip up. You can put it on either side you want, but you have to carry the knife tip up, and that is just fine with me. I have heard some people ask before on reviews and things like that why he didn't get tipped down. In this case, I guess they just didn't want to add extra material around that oversized pivot screw. But the clip is just fine for me. It's a simple bent over stamped steel, and it works pretty dang good. Moving on to presentation. I think it's really awesome. If you're into the overbuilt steam, I think this is a little bit steampunk influenced, and most people that I've talked to would agree with that. But if you're into this kind of design of sort of strange and outlandish, I was immediately drawn in by the looks of this blade. Moving on to quality, well, we have the lock problems, and that's a big detractor. And then also I've noticed that their pivot screws that they actually pride themselves on. They call this the tri-spoke pivot assembly, and they talk about it in conjunction with their ORB bearing system being a really great system. And I love it in terms of deployment, but me and Cineric 77 both had problems with the pivot screw being exceptionally soft. And when we put a Torx wrench on it, I had mine dead center set, and I was putting pressure downward and I was torquing, and the screw gave out. The little nubs that the Torx wrench bites into, those gave out, and Cineric had a very similar experience, which leads me to believe that they're not hardening their hardware good enough. And that's also pretty concerning because you want to be able to service your knife, you want to be able to use your pivot, tighten it, loosen it, those sort of things. Value. Really cool design, American made, 154 cm. But for a letter opener, I just can't recommend it. Now, I'm being a little bit facetious. I think that you could use this knife to open boxes for quite a long time and not see any degradation, but I'm pretty sure that if you had thick cardboard and you started really jamming the knife into it, you would start to see that deterioration in the lockup quality that I was talking about. I think it's that forward pressure on the blade pushing into something that made this lock deteriorate. In the second case. In the first case, it was just bad from the factory. Onto competition, well, it really depends what you want out of your blade. If you want a large overbuilt folder that you're not worried about its actual usage, this thing does pretty well, actually. If you want a large overbuilt folder that you can actually use, maybe start looking into cold steel, zero tolerance. Both of those might give you the overbuilt feeling that you're looking for, and you can get good utility out of them. Not quite as large on the zero tolerance, but you get part of the overbuilt feeling more than you really get with a cold steel. Cold steel, you can go large. If you just want a really cool folder that you can show off, at $170, the world is really your oyster. You can really make it what you want to in terms of if you want something that's more pretty looking, something that's more badass looking. The market is really wide open by the time that you get to $170 as far as production blades go. So moving on to pass-fail, unfortunately I think I have to fail this blade. And that does kind of irk me because Quartermaster are really cool guys. I've talked to them personally and they took really good care of me when I had a warranty issue. But I just can't lie to you guys, and I can't recommend a blade that costs this much, that weighs this much. And yeah, it looks really cool. It's made out of good materials, made here in America. I think the design is innovative. I think a couple of tweaks would have went a long way in this blade. Thicker locking liners and having, at least on the locking liner side, having the scale extend over and cover the locking liner, have it be a little bit occluded so that you could get your thumb in there. Same way that 99.8% of liner lock knives are done. I think that would have made this a much better blade. Unfortunately, I've had 2 of them now and both of them had trouble with lockup. I've heard other people talk about similar issues on this Quartermaster and other Quartermasters. Honestly, to me, it just looks like they're a very young company that doesn't have a couple of things ironed out all the way. Those items and the tri-spoke pivot assembly not being hard enough in terms of hardware, those are really just a bummer, but unfortunately, it was a make-it-break-it kind of thing, and it broke it for me. For a large knife, to sell it to me, you've just got to have a reliable locking mechanism. Back in terms of competition, it's hard for me not to think of this blade in terms of partially being used as a defensive folder. Like I said, that was my assumption. That's on me. They didn't really sell it that way. They do talk about how well it's made, so I think it should stand up to more than it stood up to, but they didn't really bill this as a defensive folder. However, for me to think that it was worth my while, I would have needed it to be a defensive folder. The ergonomics, surprisingly good actually. I was really impressed with how angular this knife looked, how well it did in terms of it's got a really nice occlusion here for when you're in reverse grip. It's actually pretty comfortable in hand. It's got that nice extended thumb ramp I'm always bitching about. I wish that I could get a much larger thumb ramp so that I could really extend my thumb and feel like I was getting a whole lot of power into the cut. And Quartermaster gave that. I'm really happy for that. This blade did a whole lot of things well. Like I said, the pivot assembly is one of the better that I've ever seen. I really like actuating this flipper. Unfortunately, with the locking liner not being very good, I just can't recommend it. I think I've got to give it a fail. The one special case that I can think of is if you just wanted an overbuilt EDC knife, you didn't care about how much it weighed, how much it costed, and you only had about $200 to spend, and zero tolerances weren't cutting it for you in terms of what you thought overbuilt looked like, and you really liked the steampunk design. If you had that perfect storm of desires going into buying a knife, I could say go ahead and buy this. Before we end, I want to say that I'm in no way trying to trash on Quartermaster. Like I said, they make cool stuff, and they're really cool guys. Unfortunately, this is the first blade that I've bought from them, and I just can't recommend it. I will be looking to buy from Quartermaster in the future. I hope that they see reviews like this and alter those things that we complained about. As it stands right now, I cannot recommend this blade. And that does irk me because I've invested a lot in this blade in terms of having it repaired the first time, going through and talking to Quartermaster. I've put up lots of pictures of it on Instagram, all that sort of thing. You guys know me. I don't do a negative review often. When I do, I try to do it for an honest reason, and that's what I feel like I'm doing in this case. The lock is just not built very well. Moving on to stats before we finish. Overall, it is 11 inches long. That is quite a large blade. Most people would say too large for them to carry. A lot of guys are jazzed by it, however, and I'm one of those guys. I love the large blades. The blade length is 5 inches, handle length of 6 inches. That thick blade clocks in at 0.19 inches, and the weight overall is 11.45 ounces. Really cool blade. Not sure I mentioned it. The jimping is pretty weird on that large thumb ramp that I like so much. It's not very tacky, but it is pretty comfortable, and it does give you some texture that you can push against, so that's nice as well. You guys know me, I hate giving a negative review, but this is unfortunately just a blade that I can't recommend at the current moment. I hope that they tweak it. I hope that one day I get another one of them and it's perfect. Thank you guys for watching. Stay tuned for more of the same.